My name's John Bone from the University of Aberdeen, and I want to talk very briefly about a paper that's actually already published. What the paper's about is a kind of reassessment of neoliberalism in the contemporary era, and I'm reassessing this in two ways. Firstly, the notion here is that previous kind of analysis of neoliberalism hasn't often taken account or adequately taken account of the impact of digitalisation and the prospect of digitalisation in the present. And also, I'm analysing this from a different perspective than most sociologists, because I'm applying my own biosocial model to try and get a fuller picture of why certain things are happening in contemporary society and why we need to address them. So, as I said, some of these things I'll have to cover in the questions because I have to go over this quite quickly, but I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour of the main points. Effectively, what I want to do is reassess neoliberalism for the digital era. For a long time I've been a critic of neoliberalism because I think it comes into conflict with certain fundamental human needs, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. But I also think that neoliberalism, given digitalisation and the way it's developing, has become even more disorientating, confusing, overwhelming for us in the contemporary era. And in order to describe this, I've adopted and adapted a set of concepts that have been circulating in the business world to characterise contemporary society, and that's the concept of VUCA: volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. Because I think in interesting ways this set of ideas resonates with the kind of society we're producing at the moment, and the sense of flux, disorganisation, disequilibrium that we're experiencing in contemporary society. So in the paper I talk about these various aspects of this under these four headings, but given the time that I've got here, I can only do this as a kind of overview. So what am I talking about? So the ever faster pace of everyday living, I think that's a given. This is happening in a digital society since the emergence of the web and social media. Rapid socio-economic change, Industrial Revolution 4.0, which is changing the socio-economic basis of society with implications for work, which I'll come on to in a minute. Also, I'm interested in the way in which financialisation's developed. So the combination of financialisation in this new digital world is creating increasingly insecure labour. Now, insecure labour has been a key aspect of neoliberalism itself, but with digitalisation, the emergence of gig jobs, the emergence of platform work and so on, work's becoming increasingly insecure. And that's likely to be the case going forward unless we do something about it. Also, financialisation applied to housing markets is also generating insecurity. We know that the increasing financialisation of housing and its use as an asset rather than a home has and the pricing of housing has excluded increasing numbers from affordable housing and left them in insecure housing. So we'll get this combination of insecure work, providing an inadequate foundation for financing housing, and insecure housing itself. And what I've suggested here is that the twin pillars of post-war security that stabilise people's lives, so relatively stable work and affordable and accessible and secure housing, have been pulled away. And also this is happening within a hyper-competitive environment. The advent of social media, the visibility of rising inequality. So we know that neoliberalism has generated increasing, intensified inequality, but this inequality is becoming more visible through social media and the web, and generating further pressure on people because they're exposed to the things that they don't have. And I've drawn on Joe Littler's work here to some extent because within neoliberalism, people have internalised notions of meritocracy and the notion that people's positions within society can be attributed to their talents and effort. And so, rather than blaming structural conditions when people see the successful in social media and they feel that they've lost out, rather than attributing this to the structural position that they're really in and the limitations in terms of opportunities that are accessible to them, they blame themselves. And this compounds the negative aspects of neoliberalism because they experience this as personal shame. And this occurs also within declining community. We've become more atomised. This is cheery, isn't it? Become more atomised, more estranged from each other, so there's less social support and also less state support, as welfare and social security, as we used to call it, has become more threadbare. So the structures of society, the things that enabled us to have a firm foothold in the world, have been pulled away. At the same time, we're also exposed to information overload. The world is becoming, let's say, more bemusing for us. We have lots of information from the web, lots of it's conflicting and contradictory information, so we can't get a clear picture of what the world is like and where we are within it. And this is also, we're also being impacted by filter bubbles. The filter bubbles, the algorithms in the web, have been pushing people down particular pathways. And this has got two effects. First of all, people have been exposed to more radical discourses, more irrational discourses. But this differentiation, by pushing people down different rabbit holes, makes us more estranged from each other, makes us more different from each other. At the same time, we've less trust in the authorities, we've post-truth politics, people start to believe in conspiracy theories, and in this fugue, I've argued in the paper, we become more susceptible to populist discourses. I'm going to unpack that. So, how do we understand this? Well, one of the big problems here, I've argued that there's a conflict between this world, this VUCA world, and fundamental human needs and tendencies. And I've drawn in my own biosocial model that I've been developing over the last, 2 decades to discuss this. The social map is an internalised model of self and society, the life world, and how we think it should be. So it's our understanding of the world, but also how we think it should be. So how do we do this? Well, I've drawn in biology because biology helps us explain some of the problems I've been talking about. So, in building this model of the world, what we've got to do is to internalise a memory of the world in order to negotiate it. One of the reasons for this is that the prefrontal cortex, now the brain's a concerto, so I'm simplifying here, but the prefrontal cortex that's heavily implicated in reasonable, rational and conscious thought, it's got a very limited capacity. You think about it, you can't think about too many things simultaneously. So we've got to build an internalised model so that we can deal with the world at a low level of consciousness. And this is part of the human condition. How do we do this? Well, the amygdala and other subcortical areas, the emotion centres, help us evaluate our experiences positively and negatively. And we use that to stimulate the hippocampus to create long-term memories. And the hippocampus is also the area that locates us in space. So we've got this positive and negative experiences and significant experiences and repetitive experiences that we've been exposed to over time. The hippocampus helps us lay down long-term memories, and those long-term memories help us engage with the world at a low level of consciousness, leaving the PFC free to deal with not the novel, the distinctive, the significant, as it occurs in the present. And it's a bit like when we learn to drive a car. We have to think about it consciously initially, and then we develop the neural circuitry that allow us to do it at a low level of consciousness. This is how we learn society. And because we rely on this map, we want it to be clear, consistent, predictable, positive, and we want a sense of security in that social knowledge. So we want a sense of control. In order to do this, in order to achieve this, we're engaged in complexity reduction. We want to reduce cognitive load. We don't want to be exposed to too many things happening simultaneously at the same time. So we classify, rationalise, routinise, and this is where the structuring of everyday life comes in. This is why society is structured. It's so that we can accommodate it, given the limited capacity of our conscious ability to engage with the world. But there's a key problem. This limited capacity leads us to exposed to cognitive overload. And when we're exposed to cognitive overload, we experience that as a situation where we may be missing opportunities, but also missing threats. We experience it as danger, as negative emotional arousal. Now, we might argue that that would suggest we'd be best off with a world that's very homogeneous and routinized and so on. That's problematic because we need a certain level of emotional arousal to identify the contours of our world, but also to make life meaningful. So in a sense, we're homeostatic systems. We want a big load of security and clarity and simplicity, but enough emotional arousal to make life interesting and clear, to be able to identify clear boundaries. But most of all, we want a sense of control over this process. And this is where the VUCA world denies us that sense of control. It unseats us, it unbalances us. So we experience the VUCA world as having a sense of decontrol, of dissonance. Now, if we think about Zimmel and nervous exhaustion and modernity and Durkheim's anomie, this is a further extrapolation of that. So we experience this decontrol and dissonance, this unequal, this insecure and bewildering world in terms of chronic stress. And I've characterised this as with a concept of primalisation, which I've used to characterise our situation in the contemporary world. It's a situation of negative emotional arousal, of chronic stress, of disenfranchisement, of discontent with the way the world is developing. And we experience this as fear and anger. But this fear and anger has biological implications. Negative emotional arousal overrides our capacity for reasoned thought. It affects the functioning of the PSC itself. In this state, we also become more distrustful of others. We're inclined towards othering. And we're also drawn towards simplistic, emotion-laden discourses that promises a sense of community, a sense of positive identity, a positive worldview, no matter how bizarre, which is implicated in the rise of populism and is also contributing to social and political instability. Now, I'm skirting over a lot here, but I want to finish by talking about the personal and societal implications of this. So socioeconomic status, chronic stress affects the microbiome, it affects the way we feel, it affects our gut microbiome, which affects our emotions. It also affects our epigenetics as well as neuroplasticity. It changes the way the brain's organised and the way it functions, but it also changes our epigenetics. So, DNA is not destiny. This is not a deterministic model. Our biology is constantly in interaction with the social environment, and our social experiences change the expression of our DNA in ways that impact on our longevity, our immune systems, and so on, which provides an explanation to some extent as to why, for example, during COVID, the more, let's say, poorer areas experienced this more severely than better off areas. It affects us in mental and physical ways. Neuroplasticity, epigenetics, but also it affects the body and the epigenome. Now, these effects are really, really important. And there's also a debate around this, is it can affect us intergenerationally, not just in the present, but the epigenetic effects of trauma and chronic stress experienced by current generations. So the social construction of society as it is just now can not only affect us in the present, but our children and our children's children, making it more imperative that we tackle and gain control of the conditions that are producing our own nature. Thank you very much.